Hi, I'm Ryan Kilgore, and I study diesel pickup trucks and fuel efficiency and whether or not emissions controls make an impact on them. My research question was, what impact do pre- and post-emissions engines have on the fuel efficiency of Ford and Dodge Ram heavy-duty diesel pickup trucks within the same body style? So I arrived at this question through the gap in current knowledge. So there are studies that have been done to survey fuel efficiency and compare them to EPA ratings. That's Green and Associates study. That justifies the idea of surveying fuel efficiency as an accurate measure, but it doesn't have any impact on the trucks I'm studying because they're not rated by the EPA. Heavy-duty pickup trucks aren't rated. They only rate half tons. So even after the mandates by the EPA, diesel exhaust only makes up a very small percentage of the entire pollution in the atmosphere. So it does kind of raise further questions about emissions controls and whether or not they're even necessary. So my hypothesis for my research was that the addition of emissions will decrease fuel efficiency on average. So a couple of definitions to understand before we dive into my research is DPF, or diesel particulate filter, is used to catch diesel particulates. This is the smoke that people classically associate with diesel engines. And this can be damaging to your lungs, like any particulate matter. That study I mentioned previously actually focused on that. Diesel emissions, this was before they really heavily regulated that, only made up 4% of the total particulate matter in the atmosphere, and these fine particles in general can cause cancer. So that's why they're a concern. So EGR, exhaust gas recirculation, is a system that puts the exhaust of the engine back into the intake of the engine in an attempt to reduce nitrous oxide emissions, which are dangerous because they can cause acid rain and other environmental detriment. And obviously, already mentioned diesel particulates. So the truck that I studied was the third generation Dodge Ram. So it was model years 2003 to 2009. And they had an engine that was before emissions, the 5.9 liter Cummins diesel, and it was offered from 03 to 07.5. So they were equipped with catalytic converters, as obviously any modern vehicle ever since the 70s that have been federally mandated. But it didn't have any modern active emissions controls that are regulated by the engine computer, like EGR and EPS. And in 2007.5, they switched to, because of federal mandates, the 6.7 liter Cummins, which had the DPF and EGR on the engine. So my method was essentially to develop a survey that was aligned with previous results and previous surveys to study fuel economy, to study these vehicles, because that hadn't been done before. So I basically decided that I would survey owners of every aspect of their vehicle that could impact fuel efficiency. So I look at every variable that impacts the trucks. I'll talk about that later when I start to talk about my surveys. So, and then I decided that the best way to get to a large sample size, instead of just trying to find people that have the vehicles, is to get on truck forums. There are very active places on the internet, and I knew that this is a very hot topic in the community. Many people that have newer vehicles will take their emissions controls off for reasons like that. So that's why I decided I would look at the truck forums. So, and then the next step was to analyze the data. So I had to look at the fuel efficiency that people reported, but then also contrast it with all of the other confounding variables of fuel efficiency. So essentially my survey, I had sent out a Google form and posted on the things. It consisted of 4 types of questions. So the first was physical attributes, things that determine weight and size of the truck, different cab configurations, and different classifications of truck, like a F-250 versus an F-350, or if it has 1 or 2 rear wheels, impact drag and weight. And those impact fuel economy because it takes more energy to move around a heavier vehicle with more friction. So the next attribute I asked questions about the trucks was the mechanical attributes, what kind of transmission it had, what the rear end gearing was, whether tires were taller than stock, the things that impact the mechanical advantage that the motor has. And those also impact fuel economy for the same reasons, because torque and gear reduction impacts the amount of force it takes to move these vehicles of different weights. And then I also asked about the typical driving styles and situations they have. If you're an aggressive driver, obviously you use more throttle input and that burns more fuel, and that'll drastically decrease your fuel efficiency. Everyone has experienced this when they're driving. And I also asked about the area that you're in. If you're in a very hilly area, or something that has just anything that has a lot of elevation change, it'll decrease your fuel efficiency because the same amount of energy it takes to go up the hill isn't returned on the way down. And I also asked about how it impacts it when it's loaded and towing, but I actually ended up not having a consistent enough set of things because when you have a load on your vehicle, it can vary a lot because just because it weighs the same doesn't mean it takes the same because of air resistance and all sorts of other characteristics. So I didn't really get to look at that as much as I would have liked because of the such diverse use cases of these trucks. So I focused on two main forums, which was powerstroke.org and cumminsforum.com. In general, I got a lot more active results from the Cummins forum, and that's because there's a lot more general discussion about these trucks and modifying them under stock conditions. So this leads into how it aligns to my question. So basically, I was trying to make a judgment about fuel economy without all of these other confounding variables, so I can really get to the root of the differences between the trucks, which was the engine options they had, whether or not it had emissions or not. And I was initially planning to generalize from both brands, but I had a deficit of responses from the Fords, and this was because most people with the emissions on Ford, it's prone to problems. It has a very bad reputation for that. And most people don't leave it stock because they want a reliable vehicle. So I had only one response that was a stock from the Ford out of the 15 responses I got from the Fords. So that's why I couldn't really discount that. Versus I got over 40 responses from the Dodges, and there was a large proportion of the emissions on that were or stock engine, post-emissions engines. So basically the new understanding that I've derived from this is that the 6.7 liter Cummins trucks on average have a better fuel economy than the 5.9 liter Cummins trucks. So the Ford results was inconclusive because of my previously mentioned limitation, and that there are differences because in general, the problem with this is I did ask if the truck was modified. If people modify their engines, the first thing they do is take the emissions controls off because they're very restricted from a performance standpoint, and as you'll see later, my study proves an efficiency standpoint. So it's a hard thing to get because most of the people in the truck forums are not there because they want to keep their truck stock. They are there because they want to modify it. It's not a reliability question. It's not general maintenance questions. That's not why people are generally on these forums. So I did have less responses than I would have liked of emissions on vehicles. So it's actually pretty large difference, and it makes a very large difference in your wallet. Is that I saw that in combined fuel economy, it was upwards of 4 miles per gallon difference between the trucks that had emissions and did not have emissions. And if you think about that from a daily driving perspective, how much more money you would spend over the course of a year, depending on how many miles you could drive, that's hundreds of dollars of fuel. And that's also hundreds of more tons of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere because of basic chemistry. If you burn the fuel, there has to be the gases that come from it. So the limitations too was just that, like in general, was that I needed much more responses than I got, and I tried to do all sorts of things. But the problem was that on the forums, people were questioning my study because I was comparing to similar engines, and the reason I had to compare to similar engines was because initially, when I started my study, I wanted to study the newer engines that people had removed the emissions controls from them. But there's recently been a large crackdown by the EPA, and that's implicating yourself in a federal crime. So I didn't want people to be implicating themselves in a federal crime, so I had to compare different engines. But that allows my research to not necessarily speak to what impact the emissions directly have, but the general design implications that emissions on. You have completely different designs of an engine when you're accounting for these emissions controls. And that is the impact is when you buy a new truck, whether it has the emissions or not, is the kind of fuel economy you're going to return if you leave it stock. So that's why I think that even though they are different engines, it does make a large impact to the consumer. That although mechanically different, that doesn't matter. It's the end result that you feel in your pocketbook when you spend more money on fuel. So like I said, there's other confounding variables. The one person likening their driving style, I asked on a scale of 1 to 10 how aggressive people drive in general. Some people could say that they could think that personally I drive very aggressively, but to another person that would be not driving aggressively. So there's a lot of issues with that, and I had to find a good quantitative way to measure driving style in a survey setting. I found tons of surveys, research, but I didn't find any that could really find a driving style in a survey setting. You'd have to measure it quantitatively by like throttle position or something like that, and there's no way you could report that in a survey. So the potential accuracy of the reported economy is a concern because the community in general does not like emissions controls in their vehicles because they are another thing to maintain, they make your vehicles less reliable. There's lots of general consensus that they don't like them. So people would, in general, probably want to underreport the fuel economy if they had a vehicle that had emissions on it because they don't want to have the emissions on their vehicle. And if they can make any kind of argument against it, they would want to do that. So they would, in general, want to underreport. And as I already said, the scales are relative, especially talking about the geography question I asked. Like if I could ask them where they are, but then I would have to do some sort of analysis of that, like geographic region, you don't know how much they drive, and saying what's hilly to us is not hilly to someone that lives in Colorado. So driving on mountain passes versus on our back road, the elevation change is a large number different. So, but how you rate the scales are relative. So I also faced several challenges that I were able to overcome. I initially got banned from the forums for spam because I had to post the same thing in 2 different sections to talk to people that have 2 different engines. But I didn't realize that these forums, especially not having any credibility on it, I wasn't already on these forums, that they saw that as spam. They saw it as some sort of a bot trying to spam the forum, and that's not what I did. So I managed to have to create a whole other account for one of the forums because I could never got unlocked, but I contacted their support for one of them and got unlocked. Also didn't have a long time to conduct the study. I just, you need more time to reach out to the number of people. If I had more time, I could have even reached out to people in person or talked to people at truck meets and things like that. But I didn't have that kind of time, and COVID obviously is another impact on being able to meet people in person and canceling truck meets and that kind of thing. So I had super low response to view ratio. Thousands of people viewed my surveys and only 40 clicked on it for the comments. So you can look at that, it'll show you how many people viewed it on the survey. It just astounded me how few people wanted to take the time out of their day to respond to my survey, especially when they have such a personal vested interest in it. So future directions from our research is you could take a more scientific approach than just survey analysis and self-reported fuel economy. So you could do an engine dyno, you could pull the engines out of the vehicles and test them under a simulated artificial load, and you would have an exact amount of determining factors, and you could remove the emissions equipment without facing federal fines. But the problem with this approach is that they can't accurately simulate tires on pavement, real world use, and air resistance and all of those kind of things that impact it in your testing. No matter how perfect your computer algorithm is, there's too many variables in the real world. So that still leads credence to my idea of doing a survey and seeing what people really return when they actually drive their vehicles. Another approach, you could do a chassis dyno where you strap the truck down and you spin the rear wheels against some sort of load and measure the return fuel economy during that instance. You would measure specific fuel consumption like gallons an hour, for instance, better than miles per gallon. But once again, that's still not a perfect simulation of the real world. So although these are future directions and what I'd like to undergo because they're more scientific, my research still has valid implications to the everyday consumer, and I hope that it makes people kind of change their opinion slightly about and really question the idea of emissions controls and federal mandates and looking at the science behind it. So, this is great.
Oral defense panel, you may start your questions.
Ryan, how did your review of the methods used by scholars in the field inform your selection of a research method process that is in line with your research question?
So most methods in my field do study on dynos. I obviously don't have the resources for that as a high school student. I don't have access to hundreds of thousands of dollars of facilities and engines and that kind of thing. So that's a little out of my grasp. So I instead turned to studies that weren't necessarily exactly specific to diesels, but were specific to people's fuel economy driving. So I found this study by Green and Associates that was trying to compare real world return fuel economy versus EPA ratings, and that was done by a survey that actually the federal government has a website called fueleconomy.gov, and it allows people to report their fuel economy on that website. But because my trucks aren't reported by the EPA, I couldn't pull that survey data. But that allowed me to develop my survey based on the kind of questions that that website asked.
All right, Ryan, how did the limitations of your method or data influence your new understanding?
I simply just didn't have enough responses to compare different brands of vehicle and compare it and see if this is a general trend in the entire industry or see if it's just one for one truck. And that was probably the largest limitation of the original intent of my question. I still was able to find what I needed to as far as proving that there is a difference in fuel economy between the vehicles. But I didn't end up being able to fully answer my new question because of a lack of responses in general. No matter how many times I reposted, no matter how many forums I got on, it didn't seem like I was going anywhere with at least stock engine boards.
So to kind of build off of what you were just saying, how did you handle the uncertainty of the research process?
So I just dove into the research, and if there was like I saw, I wasn't getting responses from this type of group, I just tried to focus more on that. So like if I noticed on the forum that for instance, I know that initially the people with the 6.7 liter Cummins trucks were more active than the 5.9 liter Cummins trucks, so I reposted more in the 5.9 Cummins trucks section to try to increase the number of responses I got in there and to come up with approximately similar sample size between the vehicles. That way, when I'm comparing them, I have enough to make a general conclusion.
All right, thank you so much. All right, I'd like to open the floor for additional questions.
So what does your data look like? I don't recall seeing any data.
It was that 4 miles per gallon. I could show you the spreadsheets, and I have a spreadsheet that I remember like in my initial, I didn't actually show my actual survey questions because they're too hard to read. And I have to go through about 20 slides.
Statistical analysis.
My statistical analysis, that was just commands in Google Sheets. I filtered by the trucks, and then I just filtered out the different characteristics and then ran averages to achieve my average fuel economy. Like my spreadsheet just I have a spreadsheet that has 40 entries in it, and it has all the characteristics about the truck. If it's an F-250, if it's an M350, if it's a rear wheel, what engine it has, what the rear end gearing is, what transmission it has in it, all of those kind of things. That's my data that I collected from the people.
Yeah, I enjoyed seeing the full report. I would have liked to have seen more data. But I enjoyed seeing before. I think that's great. I think that's a great result. I love it. I love hearing it.
Yeah, I think it summarized it, because I could have focused on highway and I could have focused on around town and all that. But like I said, those also, once again, are relative to what's around town and what's highway. And I think combined is most people don't just drive their truck in the city, and most people just don't drive it on highway. So I feel like showing them combined for like the purposes of our presentation and the limited time I had to present my information was just like the best thing I could show.
I guess I'm a statistical person. So just
I am too.
it gives me a minute.
Yeah. Man.
Do you think if you sort of broaden your your specific types of trucks, you would have had more people to answer? Because I know you kind of focused on the 6.4 and the 5.9. Do you think if you kind of expanded it a little bit?
So like the reason I did like the same body style was because there's so many different variables. Like aerodynamics would be completely different from one body style to another. And if I compared, and actually the engine that was later in that specific body style carried over the next body style of the truck, unchanged. But they're completely different vehicles. They have different axles, they have different transmissions, they weigh completely different amounts, so there's just too many variables to expand it beyond the same body style. And I didn't do a good enough job in my presentation explaining why I stuck to the same body style of vehicle. And I was just fortunate enough that I had different engines within the same body style, because that was the X factor, that was the only variable that I was doing, and that way I had valid results. But
In 20 minutes.
yeah.
So I know you kind of hinted around it in your presentation in the limitations and future directions portion, and I know Ms. McGaugh says this question a lot, but what's the why behind people need to know about this topic?
So it's mainly because, especially lately, that's been like a hot conversation is that people want to remove their emissions controls from their trucks so they can get better fuel economy and more reliability and that kind of thing. And you know, it's talked about in the forums. It's a common thing. Like, you know, I took the emission stuff off my truck, and now I get almost 30 miles per gallon on the highway. And I'm like, wow, that's impressive. But is that a trend for everybody, or is that just one person trying to brag about how great their fuel economy is? So that's why I just decided that I think it's a thing that's a great direct implication to the consumer buying it, and just kind of something people need to be aware of. And there wasn't any research on this, and it's also like a huge consideration when buying any vehicles, what kind of fuel economy it gets, and it's not rated by the EPA. So I feel like it kind of fills that kind of gap.
Yeah, that makes sense, coming from somebody who's not like, I'm not knowledgeable in the truck and but that makes sense why you need to be aware of that, so.
Yeah, Dominic?
I just want to compliment you and how awesome this did it. Like this just like, it just, sorry, relatable, no. What is the word? It's just really relatable to everybody. Like a lot of people can take from this something out of it that's not such an abstract concept that we just learned about and like, okay, that's something that I learned about. No, this is like, if you want to go buy a truck, you want to find out what engine you want to use or whatever. I don't know, it's just really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what made me gravitate towards, because I was like, if I want to make it interesting to people, even if you're not in the community, it's still interesting because everybody has to drive somewhere. I mean, what you drive, you know, depends on your personal choices, but everybody has to drive somewhere. So I feel like it was just kind of something that it's like there's a gap in the research, but everybody drives.
And
so I was like,
yeah, like fuel economy is so important to people, like especially with trucks. Like my dad drives his truck all the way to his job that's like 35 minutes away. So knowing that, I mean, I guess it's illegal, but knowing that he
Implicated in
could
a crime.
definitely save money.
well, and it's funny, you actually, one thing that talks about that, on the used market, because it is a federal crime, the trucks that, even though they're old now, they've like super spiked in value. Like if you find one that's the pre-emissions Cummins trucks, they're super reliable, you can stock, people are selling those for $35,000, $40,000, and it's a truck from 2005. So it's just because of the emissions. It's just it makes such a huge impact on it. And there's no studies. There's just talk among people that are interested in trucks.
Who was your expert advisor?
I've reached out to like multiple executives at different engine companies, but I never heard back. Yeah. But that was kind of a lofty.
Yeah. I'll tell you what I did love about it, and I think Dominic hits on this, is the fact that you did lay it out for a layperson like, to understand that these are all the factors that go into fuel economy and fuel efficiency. And these are all the things that you took into consideration when you were doing your research behind it. It's just very well thought out. I thought it was very well thought out. Your methodology was very well thought out. There are definitely all kinds of factors that affect fuel efficiency. My last question is, are you back on the forums talking about what your researchers found?
Not yet, but I will be. And it's actually something kind of talking about that, as people have this general consensus, but I can say, well, like taking the results from all of you people, like that were, you know, kind of to respond, the general consensus on the forum is correct, that you do return better fuel economy with a vehicle that isn't equipped with the emissions controls. And I feel like it's almost common sense, because when you think about what the emissions, what they're doing, is that they're really restricting the exhaust of an engine. An engine is just an air pump, and you're really decreasing the efficiency of something when you restrict the flow that much. So the engine people that design engines focus so much on trying to make good flow going into the engine and going out of the engine, but then when they have to put these emissions controls on them, it kind of throws a whole monkey wrench in their initial design.
Yeah, on my F-150, my emissions, y'all don't tell anybody, my emissions are definitely, they're altered. I still get terrible gas mileage, so.
Oh, yeah.
Compared to my car. But I did it purposefully. I put a chip on it, did it purposefully, and to get better gas mileage. So.
Yeah. I mean, that you're assuming you're talking about catalytic converters.
Yes.
Yeah, so.
Well, I did more, yes, my catalytic converter. I got some other things on there too, yes. Yes. We won't get into that.
I know.
As us any other questions?
Yeah, real quick, Ryan, I know you didn't get enough data
Before-
to do anything with the Ford piece, but were there 2 engine types in that same time frame with the Ford as
Yeah, there
well?
was.
Okay.
So I mean, that's what was great about these, is that the trucks run for such a long period of time, like
Right.
body style wise. I mean, because they had, for the Fords, they ran the same body style for 1999 to 2007. So there's a large variety. And I would have liked, I also asked the model year, because there were differences they made to each of the engines depending on the model year. It's talking about the aforementioned like reliability issues. They worked out most of those towards the end, but you know, people were still hesitant to buy them because they're like, oh, my engine's going to explode. And you don't want that. So.
All right, nicely done, Ryan.